Well, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. So amazing to see so many people here for this conference, an all-day conference on polarization, depolarization. So pleased that so many people could make it, and we're going to have an amazing day. So I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's College London. We're focusing on depolarization in values, attitudes, and beliefs from a comparative perspective. This is what we put in the call for papers, 3 main points from that. So I think it is true to say there is global concern about cultural, political and social divides and the implications they have for how we live together in democracy more generally. I think from a UK perspective, at least, much of this inquiry is drawn on theoretical and empirical frameworks from the US, particularly when you talk to policymakers and the media and commentary around this. So this conference is deliberately international in perspective, trying to look across international perspectives on polarization to explore theories and empirical studies in a comparative perspective. So trying to get a broader view of what's going on around the world. And we do have a truly international lineup for you today. We had 35 papers, we've got 35 papers with authors from 15 countries, and just a massive thank you to people who submitted hugely high quality papers that we got from people. And the great thing is as well that it's from people at different stages. We've got more or less a 50-50 split in people from early career researchers as well as established researchers and professors. And this is where the people come from. It does have a bit of a UK focus, as you'd expect, being based here in London, but the actual papers themselves are very international in their perspective. And then as well as that, of course, we've got 2 brilliant keynote speakers, Christian, who I'll introduce in a second after I just say a few words. And then at the end of the day, we've got Pippa Norris zooming in from the US to talk us through with her latest thinking on this, alongside an absolutely brilliant panel of David, Paula, and Anna to wrap off the day. And then there'll be drinks after that. So this is the schedule. After this section, with a bit from me and a bit from Christian, we'll have a break. And then we run into the parallel sessions with 3 streams in each. This one's on identity politics, new approaches to the study of polarization, partisanship, and polarization. Then we'll have lunch, then another parallel session with 3 streams again, and then a break, and then another parallel session with 3 streams and a break. And then we'll have the keynote from Pippa, and the panel discussion, some closing remarks from me, and then we can all discuss this over drinks over the other side. So just on that quickly, some quick housekeeping points of view. You've got your program on your seat. There are QR codes around the room that you can get the program for as well. Our location is we're going to be in here for these types of plenary sessions and some of the streams. And then we're going to have to go to Bush House Southeast, which is you go down to the bottom and then across the courtyard to the panel sessions. And there'll be lots of team members around to direct you on that. We're very lucky this is out of term time. You can see how quiet it is, which is a great treat for us. It would be chaos trying to get you from here to there during term time, but now it should be relatively straightforward. Bathrooms are on mirrored on each floor outside here and the other side of South as well. Refreshments are all in the south side, and we have that room all day, and it's an amazing space. It's got, I think, one of the best views in London of the river. If you go out on the courtyard, I would be spending most of my day there. If there wasn't such brilliant parallel sessions, I'd be spending my day in the south side taking in that sort of view. Wi-Fi, if you're not on Eduroam, lots of people will be on Eduroam and it should automatically connect. But it's King's Guest if you are not, and just follow the instructions. And this is a very cruel thing to say to people. Do not lose your visitor sticker, because I imagine most of you already lost it once, because they don't actually stick. They don't. It's like if this is our main security device, we need to get stickers that actually stick. So, but if you do lose your sticker, do ask us and we can get you another one, although really there's not many people around. I wouldn't worry too much about it. And emergency exits are all marked. We're not expecting fire alarm tests. We will direct you if we do that. Do need that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is not a paper presentation, it's not an analytical piece, because we've got colleagues who are running analytical sessions within the parallel sessions, and they'll take you through more of the pieces. But I just did want to say a little bit for the next 15, 20 minutes about the UK and the World Value Survey project that we've done before we get on to Christian. And I think it is worth reflecting on the World Value Survey, because for me, it's huge. It's very, very large in 4 distinct ways. In the way that it's got trends back to 1981, which is incredibly valuable. It also covers over 110 countries. So it's got great coverage around the world, not just the usual countries. It's got over 290 questions, so it's got incredible depth in terms of its coverage. And then obviously, because of all these features, it's the most cited survey. And vital in that is the partnership with the European Value Survey, where the sharing of questions, sharing of data between them allows us to use these data, an incredible resource that we have to understand change around the world. The study that we did in the UK was also very large, 3,600 random probability interviews in the UK, including boosts in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which is very important for people in the UK to understand where the constituent nations are going in terms of values and attitudes. So a very big, rigorous study in the UK. And it's the first time we were a full participant in over 15 years, which is really great and why we're putting such a focus on this. And this is down to lots of great work by people at King's, great team at King's, but also excellent support from people at the Behavioural Insights team, David Halpin in particular, in getting us going and then working through this with us. The Social Change Initiative in Northern Ireland, colleagues here today, and UCL with David Vosey's support as PI for the European Value Survey in the UK. And then great support too from the World Value Survey Association throughout this kind of process, and Ipsos were a great partner on collecting the data. And because it was so big and expensive, we had a lot of support. ESRC as the main funder for this, but then lots of other organizations chipped in with significant amounts of funding to make sure that we got this done. And we're seeking to answer 3 main questions in our study. Obviously, the data is collected for everyone, so everyone can answer their own questions. But these were the questions that we're looking at. What is the UK's place in the world when it comes to values, and how is this changing over time? Just to try to understand where we are. Then the second one was, is the UK polarising on values and attitudes? How are generations shifting in particular as part of that, and what does that mean for the future? And the third one was around the nations. How do the constituent nations of the UK segment in their values, and is this shifting? And what does that mean for the cohesion of the union? And obviously, this is the focus for today, this second question about polarization. And this is why this conference is so hugely important to us, because this is what we are focusing on right now. So we're looking to learn very much from all of you. And we've done 9 survey releases so far. And I just want to say a word about this, because it was really important for us to raise the profile of World Value Survey in the UK, because it didn't have much, I think it's fair to say. So we've spent a lot of time on media engagement and then packaging up the data into stories that the media and policymakers and other colleagues could get to grips with. So we actually did it, instead of putting all the data out at once in our kind of reporting, we split it up into these 9 packs, some on immigration, some on democracy, views of democracy, some on parental values, etc. All of these different types of things. And it was very successful as an approach. And we got over 1,000 pieces of media coverage over the kind of months that we took to release these. And this wasn't us just trying to increase our own fame or anything. It was to draw people to us in terms of what are the questions that they think we should be answering from a policy or practice point of view. And it's been hugely successful, lots of engagement from government departments and lots of it in civil society and lots of others on what can this tell us about it, tell us about our issues and problems. So it was very effective, we think. So all I want to do before I hand over to Christian, the main focus for this morning's session, is just run through 3 points that we think is the main descriptive story of what's been happening in the UK in this context, in a global context. And the first point is maybe a surprising one to some people in the UK, is that the UK's public stand out as being among the most tolerant nations with large shifts in the last 10 to 15 years. But then when you put it in a global comparison, not all countries are moving in the same direction. And you can see that in all sorts of ways in the data. I'll just pick out one. This is the justifiable question, whether different types of behaviours or attributes are justifiable. So this is the percentage of British public who say homosexuality is justifiable over time. You can do the same with abortion, divorce, euthanasia, casual sex. And these types of trends are incredibly important, particularly going back to 1981, because what this really emphasizes to us is that we've changed a huge amount, but mostly in the last 10 to 15 years, that this is a relatively recent change, which a lot of people don't really pick up because they got shorter term trends. Obviously it's been changing throughout that period, but it really accelerates in that last period, which is important to understand the dynamics of where society is going. And then secondly, you can put that in an international context with WVS. And what that really shows is, again, a conception that some people have in the UK is that everyone is going in that sort of direction of greater tolerance. WVS and other data sets like that are so important in being able to show that that is not the case. So this is just a selection of 20-odd countries that we use quite a lot, just grouped by a rough idea of continents, and shows the different directions that different countries and then different groups of countries in continents are going in. So the main message here, the big picture kind of message from policymaker and media point of view is actually we've seen global divergence, not global coming together on these social attitudes. And that, it does make a more complicated world for people who are thinking about how do we bring, in the type of environment we're in now, how do we actually bring people together or manage these differences in worldviews that we see across different countries, diverging worldviews. The second element of this first point is that UK respondents have high levels of social trust. This is the classic social trust question around whether most people can be trusted or you can't be too careful, and we come pretty high on this, and that has increased, not decreased in recent years. And then when you look at more specific things, we come at or near the top of lots of different elements. 98% saying they can trust people they know, which is second across the 22 countries that we use as our core comparison set. Third on whether people trust people they meet for the first time, and then top for trusting people of another nationality or people from another religion. Out of these 20-odd countries that we look at a lot, Britain is actually top, and that was a huge surprise to people given the rhetoric that we have, very strong culture wars rhetoric around Britain being quite rejectionist on this. And lots of people were surprised by this. We had one tweet that kind of summed it up in a fairly negative way, not so much about the positives, but Christ, the rest of the world must be in an even worse state than I thought, was a response from this person. But that was quite common in the reactions that we got from people. So that's point one. We actually quite like each other in the UK. There's a relatively high level of tolerance. The second point is that the UK public express continued support for democracy in principle. The principle of democracy is strongly supported, which is similar in many other countries, but then there is greater variety and increased interest in authoritarian elements of systems in other countries, not so much in the UK, but in other countries. And we'll pick up on this a lot in more detailed papers during the day. So overall support for democracy is strong in the UK and across the world. We're right up there. But the average is 87%. Obviously, people have different models of democracy in mind when they're answering these types of questions, but the support for the principle is very strong. And that's there's no consistent view in these types of, in views of democracy across different countries or continents. It kind of goes in slightly different directions, and they're all still pretty high. You can see Europe increasing hugely because of Russia, increasing stated support for democracy. But also, if you look at that orange line, that's the UK. We are one of the high risers. That is our trend, increasing support of saying that it is a very or fairly good way of governing the country. But then when you look at the more authoritarian reflex questions that Pippa will probably pick up on at the end of the day, so things like measures of whether you think a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections is a good way of governing the country, I think it is worth reminding ourselves of just how varied this is around the world. And again, these types of studies are incredibly helpful in showing the variation. You've got an average of 45% around the world, but driven by countries with very high interest in that. And again, Northern Ireland, Great Britain, down the bottom, despite the rhetoric of us liking the idea of a strong leader, not particularly supported by this or by the trends in it. So if you look at this across different countries, these are the types of patterns that you see. Differences are emerging on support for authoritarian regimes or elements of authoritarian regimes across regions. We see big increases in Africa, but also a drifting up in the Americas and Asia in terms of increasing levels of support for that idea of strong leader who doesn't support, it doesn't need to bother with parliament or elections, while the UK, very low and very flat, not something that's particularly attracting people here. So that's all quite positive from a UK perspective in some ways, that we like each other, we still support the principle of democracy, we're not particularly flirting with authoritarian regimes, but it's not all great news. The third bit is we are losing confidence in key institutions, in some key institutions in the UK. And that is not just a UK issue or a sudden acute crisis, but a long-term and chronic decline in some countries for some institutions, and this is a real challenge that I know Christian will start to pick up on. So countries worldwide, including the UK, show low satisfaction with how their political system is functioning. China obviously is quite often an exception on these types of things, but these are not high figures for many of the countries. UK down at 17%, when you break that down by the UK nations, it's down to 7%. I think, in Northern Ireland. So incredibly low perceptions of a functioning political system, probably fair in Northern Ireland because they didn't have a government at the time of this particular study. And the key point is that there's lots of surveys and polling that will create a sense of new crisis of trust. There's lots of studies on trust. They're always press released as this is a brand new crisis of trust and we've had this collapse. And this is where studies like World Value Survey are really important in having the longer term trends rather than looking at short term ups and downs. Because this is the percentage you have confidence in some institutions in the UK. That's the pattern for the press in the UK, incredibly low. That's the pattern for the police. And that's the pattern for Parliament. And they look like relatively small drifting down, but actually big changes. So you've gone from 87% of people saying they have confidence in the police in the UK down to 67% in the latest survey. You've gone from 41% in 1981 down to 23% saying they have confidence in Parliament. And then you're down at 13% of people saying they've got confidence in the press in the UK. And that's second bottom only to Egypt in the UK, which is not a good position to be in if you know about Egyptian press. But you can see here that that drop was actually way back for the UK. It went from 13, then it's kind of bobbled around at similar sort of level since the late 1980s, really. So it's not, this is not a brand new thing for us. It is a long-term issue. And because it's a long-term issue, we sort of may get used to it in the UK. But again, World Value Survey and other international surveys are really useful for pointing out that that's not normal, that these levels of confidence in institutions are not the norm around the world. So if you look at confidence in government in different countries, again, we'll see China top all of these for reasons you'll understand. But Great Britain, Northern Ireland, right down the bottom, way below the average on government, below the average on Parliament, with Ireland right down, Northern Ireland right down the bottom there, and way below the average, half the average in Great Britain for trust, confidence in political parties. So this is not a normal pattern, and it's important to remind ourselves of that. And there's confidence in institutions like Parliament. We're just looking at parliaments and congresses here. It's a kind of, when you look internationally, you get this sort of issue. You do see an increase in Asia, mostly in this pattern, driven by Philippines and increasing in China being incredibly high. But you can see in other countries, in other regions, Europe, Americas, and Africa, this kind of slow decline over time is a common kind of pattern. So this is not just about the UK. This is something that we should be worried about generally. So they're the kind of three stories that we took mostly from the data to take to media and policy colleagues to try to put that in context. And as I say, a lot of it was a surprise. A lot of it changed their views of what we were actually focusing on. But really, just for the final couple of minutes, that doesn't really touch, these are only aggregates. These are only looking at the overall averages and how it's changing over time. It doesn't really answer the question about whether we're polarizing or what the consequences of polarization are. And that is the focus for our upcoming policy lab that we're running on this. For each of those three questions that I outlined, we're running policy labs, which is a methodology that we use where you get researchers together with policymakers and practitioners. You do briefing notes in advance, you do a full day workshop with that group and trying to come to policy briefs that come out at the other end about what do you do about this. So our next one is on polarization. So what we'll be looking at for that is polarization trends in the UK compared to other countries, and then how that relates to other trends. And as Christian will talk about, there is a theoretical basis or assertion in many ways to expect increased polarization to put pressure on confidence in democratic systems and institutions, whether that's held up by the data, I think Christian will focus on, and then I think we will come to that quite a lot in the discussions today, but there is a theoretical basis to expect that. So what we'll be doing is examining trends of dispersion across different demographic and identity divides to understand whether we're really polarizing in the UK around what different identity divides and how that compares with other countries, and then trying to understand the relationship between these trends and shifts in institutional confidence, because that is the big thing that has shown up in our data so far. There's how does that polarization relate to institutional confidence and system confidence? And I'm only going to show you a couple of things. I'm conscious we need to move on, but this very simple approach that actually Pew Research Center use a lot, which they call their moving mountains approach, which all it does is, I'll start with the US, just giving you an example from 1990. All you do is you create an index of social attitudes going from traditional to more liberal attitudes, and then you divide it by Republicans and Democrats, and you do distributions, effectively just distributions of those two groups. And in 1990, one of the key trends from the US, key things to remember from the US, is that back in 1990, there was actually huge overlap between Democrats and Republicans in their social attitudes. It was not nearly the sorts of divides that we see today. There wasn't that kind of sorting by party or difference in views that we see now, because this is the pattern that you got in the latest 2017 version of WVS data, because we replicated the Pew approach. So that's why they call it moving mountains, because you can kind of imagine these mountains moving apart. So there's less and less overlap between Democrats and Republicans, and you can predict more and more about social attitudes just knowing whether someone is a Democrat and Republican. So these are the kinds of trends that you're looking at. We did the same sort of thing in the UK, splitting between Conservative and Labour supporters, and a couple of things to note here is that back in 1990, very similar point on actually there's a load of overlap between Conservative and Labour supporters in their social attitudes. And then the second thing to note is we're a bit more to the liberal side of this distribution than the US were. But then when you roll it through to 2022 in the UK, you can see some movement. You can definitely see a liberalisation where we're moving further and further in this direction, but not nearly the extent of divide between Conservatives and Labour that you see in the US between Republicans and Democrats. So we are not the US as yet, but perhaps there is some nascent polarisation between party identity and these types of social attitudes in the UK. It's something that we need to keep an eye on. And then final kind of version of this I just wanted to show is that we're doing lots of these types of analysis and other analysis that looks at dispersion types approaches. But this was interesting on left-right, self-assigned left-right identity, which is one of the questions in World Value Survey, and there's pros and cons about that sort of question. But just comparing across the United States, Great Britain, and Germany, UK sort of stands out in this by having no real divide on left-right identity on social issues. I think we always kind of thought of left-right as being more of an economic divide. It's whether you're economically of the left or economically of the right. And that was the case back in 1990. But when you run it forward to 2017 to 2022, the latest wave of this data, you're actually starting to see us look more like other countries, where your self-ascribed view of whether you're on the left is more associated with social issues now, as opposed to economic issues. So this is a really interesting thing, I think, for us about how it's not just party identity, but it's how you see left and right is shifting in the UK to be more about social issues, which is no surprise, given our focus on culture wars and all the kind of cultural divides as opposed to economic divides. So interesting on that. Final chart from me is there does seem to be some relationship between social attitude, polarization, and confidence in institutions. And I know Christian is going to pick up on this in much greater detail, much more analytically. But what's interesting is if you do those charts, those distribution charts, which Paolo, our statistician, our analyst has been doing, is you can work out coefficients of overlap between the two distributions. Then you can take those coefficients of overlap across different types of identity divides and different types of countries and plot them whether you're more polarized in social attitudes, and in this case, further to the right you are, the less polarized the country is. And then you can plot that against whether you've got more or less confidence in political institutions. And these are the sorts of patterns that we're starting to see, and this is very early analysis, but we really want to do more of that and want to hear more from you, because there does seem to be something of a relationship that the less polarized countries have higher confidence and the more polarized countries have less confidence, but it's not at all a perfect relationship, and obviously just correlational, not causal in this. But there's some interesting things in here that I think point to the fact that we need to dig more, understand more about this relationship between polarization and institutional confidence. Thank you. So that's it from me. Oh, you can applaud. Someone was going to there. Very good. You're right. All I want to say, just before I introduce Christian, is just to say thank you so much again for putting in your papers, coming today, doing this, and then thank you in advance, because we will find this discussion incredibly useful in sharpening our thinking for this policy lab that we're doing next in June. Are you okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Great. So it's just a real pleasure for me then to introduce Christian Welzel, who is Professor of Political Culture at Leuphana University, Vice President of the World Values Survey Association. Christian, please.
So thank you very much. I have been several times at the LSE, but this is my first time at the King's College in London, so it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really impressed by the size of the audience, which I didn't expect such a large number of people. In some versions of the program, there's a slightly different title announced, something like Value Change as a Selective Force in Social Evolution, but I decided to present this paper here because it speaks more to the overall theme of polarization. Maybe one remark beforehand when it comes to, one thing I wanted to say. I think Bobby Duffy and his team do a marvelous job in advertising the findings from the World Value Survey within the UK. So we in the board of the World Value Survey should actually, Roberto is also here from the board, we should take this as a blueprint to do this for other countries and regions in exactly the same manner. So it's really a great template to marketize and advertise our findings. One preliminary remark to value divergence across the world. Just 2 days ago, two co-authored paper in Nature Communication appeared where exactly based on World Value Survey data, they make the point that globally speaking, we have more value divergence over time, especially when it comes to my index of emancipative values, which is very closely related to the social liberal index. So what the two authors are claiming, the world as a whole is growing apart on those issues, whereas within regions, neighboring nations are becoming more similar to each other, which is an interesting statement. However, I commented on this already, and it's in the German media. I made 2 points. One is they overstate the amount of divergence that has been occurring over time. And secondly, they gloss over the most important point, why this divergence is happening, because in most regions in the world, we see over the generations an increase in emancipative values. But the speed by which this is happening is different. And therefore, we see the lines growing apart. But this is a totally different story than saying the world is getting more diverse because regions are moving in opposite directions. That is not true. All right, to my presentation. This is co-authored work. Here you see my co-authors, and this is part of a European Horizon project that's abbreviated as TRUDEM, Trust in European Democracies, and it's initiated basically by the World Values Survey, and Pippa Norris is also involved in this project. And what we are basically looking at is at the patterns and trends in institutional trust, so trust in parliament, government, parties, and the like, and how this is moving around in different regions within the European Union. So this is focusing on the EU 27. What we are looking at in our working package, I call it here the democratic stress chain. So it's meant to be a cascade of negative influences sequentially related to each other. And you get to this narrative when you put together the social or socioeconomic inequality literature. Think of Piketty, or think of Stiglitz, The Price of Inequality. The deconsolidation literature, one of the main authors is sitting here, so Roberto, and the literature on how democracies die and backsliding. Then you get something along these lines. So the point of departure is growing social divisions, socioeconomically speaking, but also culturally speaking because of migration. So growing social divisions, as a consequence of that, we get values growing more and more apart across the different social segments that we have in the society. As a consequence of that, people getting also more effective polarization and hate each other more across the aisle. So we get also a loss of a civic sense. And as a consequence of that, populist parties, especially right-wing populist parties, increase their vote share, and that then leads to backsliding. That's basically the narrative that we have. Another take on the same issue, I think many in the room would agree that the most important cleavage that we right now have in modern democracies, I call it here the solidarity cleavage, is between cosmopolitanism and nativism. And this is all about migration. This is, in the meanwhile, more important than socioeconomic classic left-right cleavages. And then we get something, we call it a trust cleavage. So alienation, when people have more distrust, and allegiance if they have more trust. And then you get a typical fourfold matrix. And I guess the worrisome are the ones that go moving into the direction of disaffection. And the most problematic corner is basically this here, where we think that is the electoral base of right-wing populism. So alienation plus nationalism. Another take on the story, it goes like this. Here the point of departure is a little bit different. So we start out here with my own research and findings, namely that we find an increase on the average in the population on emancipative values, or you take social liberal index from Bobby. But this happens in different segments of the society at different speed. And you see that increase most strongly in the upper and center middle class segments. So mostly among population segments with higher levels of education, whereas the lower middle class is supposed to be slower on these changes or even have a reactionary counter response, so cultural backlash, and maybe even moving in the opposite in a more authoritarian direction with their values. So authoritarian ideological reaction among lower middle class segments, and then we get growing class polarization over authoritarian versus emancipatory ideological cleavages, and then we get three consequences of this. In what causal order they are might be debatable, but these are the consequences. Declining institutional trust, especially among the lower middle class segment, declining support for liberal democracy, or democracy and its liberal elements, especially again among the lower middle class segment, and then a growing vote for right-wing populist party and readiness to support their ambition to cut back on democracy's liberal principles, and then you are right into backsliding. So we try to analyze which of those linkages here are really working and how much of this narrative is actually true when we look at public opinion data. And for the EU27, we are taking the World Value Survey and European Value Study data, and we just finished replicating what we find with those data with the European Social Survey, and we find the same results also with the ESS. Well, we wanted to start a little bit with the socio-economic inequality literature and look at class segments in the society. One alternative possibility to do that is subjective social class, which we have in the World Value Survey, where people self-attribute themselves when asked either to working class, lower class, middle class, or upper middle class. But we found that problematic because we do not know how comparable these self-attributions are across countries, because connotations of the working class are probably different from one country to the next. So we decided to do this only as a double check, but focus more on objective data. And we have in the World Value Survey a 9-point index, ordinal index on education level, and we have a 10-point index on income level. But we also thought that these fine-grained categories are not exactly comparable across the different education systems and income hierarchies across different countries. So what we did, we took both of those scales and divided them in three parts, simply by looking at the distribution. So we looked at the curve and then took the ones who are at the left side of the distribution. So the lower third is low, coded 0. The ones in the center are middle on both scales, so coded 1, and the ones on the right-hand side are coded high, so this is the upper third on both scales, and then you get this combination here of different categories. So it's a 9-point index, 9-point categorization. The problem is only you have the same number for some of those combinations, and so we did it in a different way. So we took education as the major differentiator, low, middle, high, and then took income in each of those three categories as the second or minor differentiator. And then we get the 9 different categories that we see here. And you see it in the right-hand side. So forget the left-hand side. You see it in the right-hand side of the distribution. So this is this 9-point, goes from 0 to 8. 9 categories is this 9-point social class index. This is overall pooled data, right? What you see here. And then it's interesting, when you argue from the idea societies should be middle class centered, that's also very important in democratic theory, because it was said since Lipset or even Aristotle already that the democracies are typical for middle class centered societies. We see here there is a center right in the middle category. And then we have 2 additional centers in the lower scale. It's this here, lower middle class A, and in the upper half of the scale, it's upper middle class B. So lower middle class, center middle class, upper middle class. These are the 3 groups we are now focusing on, and leave aside the others because they don't have so much demographic weight. So we don't want to look at polarization by looking at relatively small groups. We want to see whether the bigger groups are polarizing with each other. And that's just another depiction of the same thing. We're looking at a couple of cleavages that from the political party literature are well known, and we can say those are cleavages that are typical for all mature post-industrial democracies. So we're starting with the market cleavage, even though we don't expect polarization there to happen so much, but simply because that's the classic. So classic left-right issues on economic redistribution. Then, of course, we look at, we have 2A and 2B because they speak to the same theme, which is nativism versus cosmopolitanism. So openness to migration or rejection of migration. And we look at migration in the first place. This is just one item where people are asked whether the government should let anyone in, should be more restrictive, or should have very restrictive rules and reject migration. And 2B is another take on the same issue. Here we ask people how much they accept neighbors of a different race or neighbors that who are immigrants. Yeah? So 2 items here. And the 2 are a little bit different because migration is about future policy, and this diversity question is more about how the situation is right now. And we will see that makes a difference. And then we have the sexuality cleavage over more restriction versus widening of reproductive freedoms. Today is a big debate in the Polish parliament about abortion, for instance. And then the sustainability cleavage over prioritizing environmental protection or job creation and economic growth. So these are the cleavages we're looking at. And so what we now do is kind of a mapping and tracking exercise. So we're looking at our 3 selected class segments and look if they have moved apart over time on these cleavages. And in order to make the picture not too complicated, we choose 2 time points, namely wave 3 of the WVS, which is basically the mid till end 1990s, depending on when the survey has been done in which country. So mid to end 1990s. And then the latest, wave 7, which varied from 2017 to 2020, depending on which country we are looking at. So here we have a 25 to 30 years time range, and we can be sure if we see movement here, it's not a fluke by looking at a short periodical cycle or something like this. What we also do, we include always the trust cleavage. So distrust versus trust, we will see this always on the horizontal line, and then plot this against cleavage number 1, 2A, 2B, 3, 4 in different graphics for different countries over those time points. Now, we had 2 additional cleavages under consideration, but this is more in our appendix. An additional one is to look at, and that was inspired by Roberto's deconsolidation thesis. We're looking at whether people's understanding of democracy has been changing over time, maybe moving into a more authoritarian notion of democracy. So we looked at that as well. And we looked in addition at secular versus religious as an additional cleavage. We have done that as well, but it's not in our paper. Now, this is the analytical matrix that we basically get, and we get over the EU27, we get 2,500 aggregated data points. So this is quite a complex matrix and analytical scheme. So we had to, for the presentation, to focus on exemplary countries, and our point of departure here was the European Union's 4 major geohistorical regions. On the one hand, the Western core, where the European Union has originally been founded. Then we have the Nordic region, we have ex-communist Eastern Europe, and we have the Mediterranean South. And our decision for here was to pick from each of those regions the population largest country. So for the Western core, it's Germany. For the Scandinavian North, it's Sweden. For the Mediterranean South, it would have been Italy as the largest population, but our data on item coverage was too patchy here. So we took Spain instead. of Italy, and for the post-communist East, the largest population lives in Poland. So we now do this tracking and mapping exercise for those 4 countries, for each cleavage and so, and we will see what we find. Starting with, I skip over this here because it's more over the pooled sample. So Germany. Market cleavage, more down means more right, so more deregulation, more up means more intervention. This is based on these items about redistribution and income equality and whether the state should regulate the economy more or less. As we expected, class differences on classic left-right are tiny. So this does not seem to be anymore a polarizing factor in post-industrial modern democracies. These class distances are relatively small. We always do a thing that we show almost the entire scale range so that one can get a sense on how big differences really are. And then we see how lower middle class, middle class, upper middle class are moving. There is no move on left and right, either up or down, nothing. But there is a move on the trust cleavage, but it's surprisingly going to the right-hand side. More trust, more confidence in institutions. And we look here at parliament, government, and parties, those 3 summarized. So more. And you cannot speak of increased polarization on the basis of this here, but maybe on the other cleavages. So this is now migration cleavage, inclusion up, exclusion down, but it actually went a little bit up and not much more apart. So the distances between the social classes have not been dramatically grown on that either. What we also do, but we have no time point over this, so we also plot, when possible, the supporters of right-wing populist parties into these maps. And here's one feature that is already absolutely marketed. In Germany and in the other countries, you will see the supporters of right-wing populist parties differ from the remainder of the electorate very clearly on the trust cleavage. And mostly to the left-hand side, so distrust. And that is mapping on the anti-establishment rhetoric of right-wing populist party leaders that we find almost everywhere. Interestingly, we have other graphs where we also place non-voters. They are always very close to right-wing populist supporters, which also shows us this is mostly the electoral base from where they are mobilizing. So there is a growing camp in the population that, or it has been a growing camp in the population moving into the non-voter camp that has not been mobilized for a long time until the populist parties came on the stage. And they're now successfully bringing these people back to the polls. Interestingly, also these right-wing populist supporters, they are not so strongly social-demographically profiled as we thought. Of course, there are more male than female. They are usually somewhat less educated, but this is not a linear distribution. What we really find is that university degree or not, it's a dichotomous thing. So university education still seems to be a firewall to make people immune against the temptations of right-wing populism. But below university education, we see not a linear monotonous distribution in terms of differentiating the electorate. With income, there is even some high-income groups among those right-wing populist supporters, usually petty bourgeoisie, people like plumbers, carpenters, shopkeepers who can earn quite a lot of money. Yeah? So this is not all about deprivation when we look at right-wing populism. Diversity cleavage, so accepting neighbors who are ethnically and linguistically different, very high tolerance level, already in the mid-90s, and no change. But here, again, the alternative for Germany is markedly different from the remainder of the electorate. Sexuality cleavage, this is what we find in all 4 countries. In all 4 countries, we find an increase, and pronouncedly, in emancipatory attitudes, tolerance of sexual freedom, and reproductive rights. So this went up everywhere, and again, no indication for polarization. Interestingly as well, even though Alternative for Germany voters are a bit more conservative on this, but they are not markedly different on this issue. They are also not markedly different on the market cleavage. So this is where the right-wing populism is actually not so profiled. But they are clearly profiled when it comes to migration and to trust in institutions. Last one. This was a stunning increase in pro-sustainability, climate change protection attitudes in Germany. Here as well, right-wing populists are not so markedly different from the remainder of the electorate. But again, no indication for a dramatic increase of polarization. Now we switch to Sweden. And we get basically, I have to speed up a little bit, we get basically the same result, a little bit more in favor of interventions, a bit more left, but not much, and no indication for polarization. And in Sweden as well, the electorate moved to the right side, so towards more trust in institutions. And the Sweden Democrats are also, again, like Alternative for Germany, clearly positioned, much less trust in institutions than the remainder of the electorate. And in Sweden as well, very close to the non-voters. Diversity cleavage, same picture as in Germany. High tolerance level, no increase of polarization. The migration question was not asked in Sweden, unfortunately. So we cannot follow the trend over time. We have, however, one question, it's not plotted here, where we ask people when jobs are scarce, whether nationals should always have priority. And here we see actually a progressive increase. Swedes have become more tolerant, except for the Sweden Democrats. Sexuality, same picture as in Germany, rise and no polarization. Sustainability, same picture as in Germany, rise and no polarization. Now we go to Spain, Southern Europe. The picture is a bit different, but it's not clear what is going on. One group goes more leftist, the other group goes more rightist, but there is no indication for an increase in polarization. In terms of trust movement, not much is visible, except that the upper middle class went a little bit to the left, so to less institutional confidence. Diversity cleavage. Upper middle class went down. Other than that, not much of a movement is visible over 25 years. And it's a high tolerance level anyways. And again, no indication for increased polarization. Same here, sexuality cleavage, that goes up in all countries without exception. And again, we see no indication for increased polarization. Sustainability, same thing. Now again, change perspective, we go to Eastern Europe, Poland. Now the picture becomes a bit different because this is typical of most ex-communist countries, probably reflecting the turmoils and the repercussions of the transition from socialist to market economies and what happened there. So there is a clear increase of distrust among the electoral segments. Interesting, the supporters of Peace Party are differently located here as in the other pictures. They are now showing more trust. But this is because the last survey was done when they were still in power. And then it's logical, right? Then we looked at diversity. Again, no increase of polarization. Actually, not much change on this vertical axis here. Sustainability challenge here in Poland, it went down, different from what we saw in the other countries. This is evidence from a recent book by Hans-Peter Krisi. Different data, ESS-based, and you get the same message, however. There is no visible increase, generically speaking, in different regions of Europe in terms of ideological polarization in the electorates. We also have run a couple of regression analyses, basically multi-level models, where we try to analyze institutional trust of individuals as a dependent variable and try to explain it with social demographic characteristics, with people's positioning on the cleavages that we have. And it is very clear what comes through is that institutional trust is lower where when people are located on the migration cleavage in a conservative or rejective position, and when they have, no, distrust what was the dependent variable, so you cannot take it double way. And then there were a couple of, but not many, and it was interesting that country level characteristics, like we looked at inflation, unemployment rate, interest rates, GDP growth, had very, very little influence on individuals' institutional trust or distrust. That was a bit surprising for us. Also, the quality of democracy as a variable did not play a strong role. What did carry through to some extent, but much less so than we thought, is we looked at absence of corruption and rule of law. So basically quality of institutions had not such a strong influence. Besides, we had another take on this trust cleavage in that we inspired a little bit by Pippa's skeptical trust terminology that she's using. We followed a residual approach in that we regressed each individual's reported confidence in institutions level, regressed it on the actual quality of the institutions, looking at rule of law scores from VDEM and absence of corruption scores also of VDEM. And then you get positive residuals, which means you have people that report higher trust than the country actually deserves, given its actual quality of institutions. And you get people with negative residuals, meaning that they underestimate their country's actual institutional performance. And you have people who have very small residuals, which means they give a kind of an accurate assessment of their country's actual performance, institutionally speaking, when they report their own confidence level. This didn't change the picture at all. So this different take on the whole issue. So we do not find that the original narrative finds any support at any of these interlinks. And for us, the conclusion then is when the success, the electoral success, which is undeniable, the rising electoral success of right-wing populist parties cannot be related to the demand side, to an increased ideological polarization in the population. When it cannot be related to the demand side, there must be a problem on the supply side, and that is the party systems. And it's a little bit speculative. Our argument is, and there is some research in Germany, for instance, Armin Schäfer has done a lot on that, representation deficits. So they look at how people's income groups are represented in policies. And they found that lower income classes and other people that are more marginalized are underrepresented in the policy making. And we believe that led to let these electoral segments grow by becoming or moving into the non-voter camp. And then they were even less relevant for policy making. And that created a lot of frustration, but it didn't matter, as in the right-wing populist period, we had certain gatekeeping and agenda-setting monopolies related to the traditional parties and traditional media that reinforced these representation deficits. And what changed the situation? The social media, dramatically. They broke traditional gatekeeping and agenda-setting monopolies, and now new actors have access to the political arena and can mobilize these frustrated non-voters. So it has much more to do with problems on the supply side than with problems on the demand side, speaking about public opinion. So that's my conclusion here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and criticism.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. And I really do recommend the paper that this is based on. It's a great paper, and I'm sure we'll be sending around resources after that, so do pick up on the paper after that. And then just as an aside, VDEM, I think we've got colleagues from VDEM involved in VDEM in the varieties of democracy indices in the audience, and it has been incredibly useful for our work as well, comparing attitudes to those assessments of the nature of democracies in different countries. So that's an incredible resource. So we have time. We have 10 minutes just for questions for Christians. Any questions or comments from the audience? And I think we've got people with mics. So there's one there, and one there, and one there. So we've got three. Let's take three together. If you can just say who you are and...
Yes, thank you. My name's Sarah Wilkins from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Thank you, Christian. Very interesting talk. Some great results to break down. I want to know, so if you look at other groups as the independent variable rather than class, do you see more polarization? So say generation, gender, I work on religiosity, for example, or are you kind of seeing similar trends? Because you mentioned you were using other factors as well, right?
We are still in the, about doing that. So this is work in progress. We did do income and education separately, and we looked at gender, and we didn't find very much there. We did not yet look at cohorts or generations, so this is work that still needs to be done. And also maybe one more remark. We also don't have in the World Value Survey a measure on with which we could grasp effective polarization, so that people hate each other more across the aisle. We don't have any measure about that, and this is still a possibility that this has increased over time.
Yeah, no, really good point. We did actually, because at the end of WVS, you're allowed to ask your own special questions, and we did ask some effective polarization questions in the UK only, and it is a very powerful tool, so it would be good to think about that for the future. We've got, yes, please.
This is a UK question about geography. In 2019, you had constituencies where kind of nearly half of people didn't vote, and you had constituencies where 80% of people voted. I wonder if one of the kind of dynamics is a geographic dynamic. Are we kind of tearing ourselves apart geographically as well? What are the kind of subnational and local trends in relation to polarization?
I mean, this would relate to taking rural-urban divide as another grouping of the society. We haven't done that yet either. So this is also something on our to-do list for sure. So I cannot report any results on this at this moment.
Great, but I'm sure some of the papers actually that we've got today do look at geography. So I think that we'll be able to pick up on some of that as we go through it. Yes.
Okay, Wolfgang Ascher from the University of Salzburg. Thank you very much, Chris, for your fascinating picture and this highly important research. I have two questions, because your most recent data is, I think, based on early 2020. And of course, we might have effects also based on the pandemic, and the impression of the people now living in this polycrisis may sharpen polarization. So do you maybe have also some more recent evidence or survey data for your thesis? And the second question is, the cleavages are of course based on your indicators, so maybe you can also tell us which indicators you used, because especially when it comes to sustainability, varies because of the climate change may rising, but this doesn't mean that there are really substantial, that the people are really ready for substantial transformations of society. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. There is one problem we have, is that some of the surveys from the seventh wave have been done pre-pandemic, and some of them in the middle of the pandemic. And we know that this has an influence because in many cases the institutional confidence has been increasing because of the pandemic. Typical rally around the flag. effect. So this is not easy to eliminate out of the data. I did also something with Roberto on the impact, so like a causal lateral experiment. And I have 2 other papers on the influence of the pandemic on trust and life satisfaction, and we know there are some effects for sure. Also on the indicator side, the situation is less than ideal, because for some of those cleavages we have just one item, and the sustainability one is a one item. People are asked, okay, when 2 things are coming in conflict with each other, which one is more important? And the 2 options are if there's an economic, so environmental protection has always priority, or job creation and economic growth has always priority, and a middle option. So this is a one item cleavage, so it's not ideal, but that's all we have.
Very good. Yeah, just a quick reflection, because the UK was one of the few countries that was actually done post-pandemic within it. And to be honest, we were really worried about that being a real break in trends or comparisons with other countries. And while there were definitely shifts, and we can see from lots of other studies that did have an effect, it wasn't really the break and cleavage that we thought, looking at the trends in lots of, particularly if you're looking at confidence and in that kind of long-term perspective. It didn't suddenly push us in a different direction. So I do wonder whether we overemphasize some of the elements of the impact of the pandemic outside of specific variables rather than the kind of general element of it. Yeah, Larry.
Thank you, Christian.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Christian. My name is Mario Schafbelik, working for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And you know, we have the election coming up in Europe in June. And my colleagues react very differently to these findings. On the one hand, most people are quite terrified with what's going on and where things are moving. Obviously, given the cleavages here, and some see this as just a correction of the system. So basically, as you said, the agenda-setting power of the elites or the educational elite has been broken, and now we see a correction in democracy towards these concerns. And I would be very interested in your take on this. What should we be? Should we be terrified, or should we be seeing this as a good thing, potentially, that now people who have been traditionally disregarded, potentially, having a vote?
Well, this would require a more normative statement that is related to my own political preferences. I had an interesting discussion with this with Hans-Peter Krysi, who also said, or has some arguments that we can also see in certain elements of the electoral success of right-wing populism a corrective of certain before existing representation deficits. He has also made the argument that the right-wing populists are not necessarily generally anti-democratic. So we had this discussion. Democracy has a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension. In the horizontal dimension, what we are talking about is separation of powers, independence of media, independent judiciary, checks and balances. In the vertical dimension, we're talking about people's sovereignty and the will of the people, and maybe even direct democracy. And I think the problem of right-wing characteristic of right-wing populism is that it is unbalanced on those 2 dimensions, because it's ready to cut back on the horizontal dimension by reducing liberal elements, but it's really strong on the vertical dimension, because they're very much in favor of majority will and these kinds of things. So I think it's a mixed bag, and also depends how the established parties are handling the topic, and I think it has been underestimated for long. I can tell this from the German case for sure. It has been underestimated for long how serious people are concerned about migration. And it's actually not so surprising, because if you look in the German data, 99% of all parliamentarians have a university degree. 99% of all media journalists, especially high quality outlets, have a university degree. This is not descriptive representation of the population, and it's easy that those people also move in a certain progressive liberal bubble where we talk about gender-just language and other huge problems, and that people cannot identify with, and that kind of that drove the emancipatory agenda so far, that the elite sort of has also partly out-liberalized part of the electorate, and the rise of right-wing populism is a corrective, or at least a seismograph of this development.
I'm going to make one final question, but Christian is around all day, so we can pick up.
Thanks very much for a fascinating presentation. I just want to pick up on your last point, that what's happening if it isn't increased polarization in terms of values, and you're suggesting that the media and the political system has a lot to do with that. Two questions. One is the question of the media, I think, perhaps needs to go deeper than just social media. And I just wonder, if, A, what sort of data is in the value surveys about media use? I know there's a general media trust question, because it's not just the social media, for example, that promoted Trump. It's a polarization of the conventional media into two camps, and it's also the inability of the so-called mainstream media not to put the news, statements by someone like Trump in the news. So this issue, you're right, there's an issue of access, but I think it's broader than just because we have social media, people can get on. There is something going on under that in those attitudes, I think, and looking more deeply at the media, I think, would be important. The other question is about inequality, and you, I thought, were saying that by looking at whether people are in favor of more regulation or not, you were getting at the question of inequality. But I just wonder if, in terms of the social distance between groups, and particularly the disaffected, is there something about increased relative deprivation, particularly, let's say, rural middle class, not even lower middle class, who feel that the educated city dwellers are doing a lot better than they are? And this is a sort of dissatisfaction which is fundamentally economic in the sense, not just values driven.
We will know more about that when we get World Value Survey Wave 8, because there we have newer questions on media usage, including social media usage, which we didn't have included so far. So this is for the future to look into. We did have, however, in the Values and Crisis survey that I have initiated, which was a Corona survey, and here we had a panel, so asking the same people throughout different stages of the crisis in Germany and the UK. It was done by Bilendi, which have a very good panel with good, where you can also introduce good quota characteristics. And here we had a question on how much people trust into the established media versus the social media. And that was very clear. People who trust more into the social media also were more likely to support conspiracy theories and more likely to not support government measures like lockdowns and other restrictions. So there's a relatively clear pattern. Relative deprivation should show up in our data in that people belonging to the lower middle class are more distrustful, but we do not really find that. The distances here are not that big. Even though in Germany, for instance, the upper middle class has somewhat more trust in institutions than the lower middle class, which is to be expected, but the differences are small.
Great. Great. Well, just a quick reflection on that social media. But I think it's increasingly pointless to think of anything other than an information system where social media and traditional media interact with each other. So I think what Chris was saying is correct. Social media kind of acts as a spur of that, but then there's a reaction in media and it becomes such an interactive between those two. So it's kind of, I think we should be careful not to miss those interactions between the two, because it's systemic. It is a system now where one feeds off the other. Is very important. And then just a plug for, on the inequality point, I think a really important point, but there is going to be papers looking at the impact of inequality in the breakout sessions today. So that's going to be awesome. So that's it from our first section. First of all, just again, massive thanks to Chris for amazing presentation. and now you have a break. It is on that south side where you were before. I do urge you to go out, have a look on the terrace while it's not raining. It's a great little window we have without rain. Do have a look. It's a lovely view.